Now, let me introduce Virginia Anderson. She is the Diane and Michael Maher Assistant Curator of American Art at the Harvard Art Museum. She is co-editor with Theodore Stebbins and Kimberly Orcutt of the book American Paintings at Harvard, Paintings, Watercolors, Pastels, and Stained Glass by Artists Born 1826 to 1856. A painting in the Harvard collection of the Empress Dowager of China inspired her talk today. Virginia?
In June 1905, artist Hubert entered the Imperial Palace in Beijing to paint the portrait of the notorious Empress Dowager of China, Cixi. In letters to his family, he captured the moment. First came 2 eunuchs bearing fans, then a dozen attendant eunuchs, followed at last by the Empress herself, carried by 8 more eunuchs in a golden chair at shoulder height. In awestruck tones, Vos described her as the goddess of 400 million people. An academic realist painter of society portraits and ethnographic studies, and something of an entrepreneur, Vos had been summoned by the imperial court from his studio in New York City to paint the 70-year-old Empress Dowager. The ruler of China from 1861 until her death in 1908, the Empress Dowager was, for both Westerners and the Chinese, a mysterious and controversial figure. During her lifetime, she was castigated by her critics as a manipulative and profligate ruler. And yet, she was equally defended by her admirers as an educated, talented woman who rose above the constraints of her cloistered life to fight for the integrity of her empire. From his encounter with the Empress Dowager, Vos created 2 remarkably curious paintings. One, the full-length commissioned portrait, now in the collection of the Summer Palace, Beijing, and shown here on the left, is an idealized, flattened, symmetrical rendering of the Empress as she would have appeared at about 30 years old, less than half her actual age, surrounded by ceremonial decor. Vos kept for himself a second, 3/4-length portrait, now in the collection of the Harvard Art Museum. This painting is closer in technique to his European academic style, but with softer brushwork, depicting the seated Empress in a frontal pose that gives the painting an almost 2-dimensional feel. Today, I will tell the story of how these 2 portraits came to be and show how they are each hybrids of Vos's Western academic realism and the traditionally codified forms of Chinese imperial portraiture. Together, these 2 paintings served the needs of both artist and subject, functioning as a kind of propaganda in 2 very different cultural milieux, the imperial Chinese court and turn-of-the-century Western art salon. Born in Maastricht, Holland, Vos studied painting at the Royal Academy of Brussels, continuing his studies in Paris and Rome. He began his career as a social realist, painting interiors and portraits from almshouses, asylums, and hospitals in Brussels and London. And here I'm showing you his painting, The Knitting Room, from 1889. He moved his studio to London in 1887, where he continued some of his social realist work, but at this point the focus of his painting shifted to society portraiture. On the left is a portrait of the young Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, painted during her visit to London, and on the right is a portrait of American artist Alice Pike Barney, here in the Smithsonian's collection. Society portraiture was no doubt a more lucrative practice, and it sustained him for the remainder of his long career. Always an entrepreneur, Vos also opened 2 art schools during his time in London. Peripatetic and energetic, Vos was delighted when the Dutch government appointed him the Deputy Commissioner for Holland to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Vos's experience at the World's Fair shaped his life in 2 significant ways. One, he fell in love with America and decided to make it his home. Leaving behind his wife and 2 children in Europe, he settled in New York, marrying in 1897 Eleanor Kaikilani Graham, a member of the Hawaiian royal family and herself a divorcee. This is his portrait of her from the year 1900. 2, Vos became fascinated by the ethnographic displays of the Chicago Exposition, such as the Javanese display shown here on the right. Many of these displays were grouped on the midway, shown at left. His already established interest in portraiture burgeoned even further with this exposure. In his own words, it was during the World's Fair in Chicago, where the officials had brought together the greatest collection of the different people of the globe ever reunited in one spot at a tremendous expense, that I began to study the works I could get hold of on ethnology, and was shocked to see what poor specimens the principal authors had to illustrate their very superior works. I thought it might be possible to establish a type of beauty of the different original aboriginal races before they became too much mixed or extinct and soon got to work. Vos decided to capture the native types of the world with his brush. Vos's ethnographic project was the focus of his art on and off for the next 6 years. To begin with, in 1897, he spent 8 months on a reservation in Fort Totten, North Dakota, painting Native Americans, such as in this portrait of a Sioux chief. He then traveled westward to Hawaii, Indonesia, Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong. Echoing his earlier professional practices, Vos seems to have selected from 2 ends of the economic spectrum. On one hand, he portrayed some of the working class people he encountered, as in these 2 portraits of a young fisherman and a musician from Hawaii. On the other hand, the majority of the paintings seemed to be of the nobility to whom his society connections gave him access, as in the case of his portrait of the Korean prince Min Sa-ho, shown on the left, and the Javanese prince at right. He concluded his travels in China, where he painted works like this young woman of Fuzhou and a portrait of a young Manchu man. As you can see, most of Vos's compositions were for the most part bust or half-length portraits that feature their subjects in a lively manner with attention to detail in the particularities of the face, clothing, and accessories. Vos's trip to China took place in 1899, a few months before the Boxer Rebellion, and Vos noted the political tensions he experienced in certain regions. During this visit, Vos sought permission to paint the Emperor or the Empress Dowager, but he was unsuccessful. He was able to paint Yuan Shikai, shown here on the left, a viceroy who would later briefly become the first president of China. He also painted a portrait of Prince Qing, uncle to the emperor, shown on the right. The location of the original portrait of Prince Qing, which Vos left in China and which was presumably a full-length portrait, is unknown, but descendants of the artist have retained this bust-length study. In the end, Vos's portrait resulted in about 40 paintings, which were exhibited at the Union League Club in New York and the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., as well as the Paris International Exposition of 1900. One reviewer decided that Mr. Vos has found nothing to prove that racial types are disappearing and that a world type is being crystallized. Multiple authors did, however, observe resemblances between the racial types, with one, Charles Decay, noting that the Hawaiian musician could pass for a Provençal, the Javanese prince for a Basque. He mused, "We are constantly haunted with a vain imagining that Europeans and Americans are possessed of a noble type. But are we? Why not confess at once that the world is smaller and the mixture of human races is more ancient than our race vanities would have permitted us to believe?" I would argue that in part, Vos's artistic style and his approach to his subject matter contributed to this kind of analysis. Eschewing Impressionism for academic realism, Vos kept his painting style traditional and conservative. A 1901 critic described his portraits as delicate, smooth, and accomplished. In keeping with his American and European society portraits, Vos rendered his ethnographic subjects with dignity, care, and a certain amount of glamour. The exotic was made fashionable and tangible to Vos's Western audience. Perhaps it was this sensibility that made Vos's work appealing to the Empress Dowager. By the time of his arrival in China, the Empress had been on the throne for over 40 years, since the untimely death of the Xianfeng Emperor, who had selected her as one of his concubines. As a woman from a low-ranking Manchu clan, her rise to power was due to her bearing the emperor his only child. Following years of power struggles, Cixi found herself sole regent of China, supporting, or most would say controlling, first her son and then, following his death, her nephew. Rumors flew that she had virtually imprisoned and poisoned her nephew, had had his favorite concubine thrown down a well, and had taken money allocated to the suffering navy and used it to refurbish the imperial palaces. Vos was confronting an empress with a notorious reputation in the West, further tarnished by her initial support of the Boxer movement. While the first widely read and rather scandalous biography of her did not appear in the West until 1910, she was, by 1905, already the subject of much gossip and speculation, and the traditional sequestering of the imperial family within court walls didn't help. In the aftermath of the disastrous anti-foreign Boxer rebellion, which greatly weakened the Qing dynasty, Cixi sought a rapprochement with the West. She invited diplomats, missionaries, and, most importantly, their wives, into the imperial sanctum, where she charmed her guests with entertainment and gifts. The Empress Dowager realized that in order to assuage the Western powers, she needed to at least give the impression of making her court and herself more accessible. What is certain is that despite the insular court structure, which hampered her actions and literally walled her off from the realities of everyday life among her subjects, the Empress was aware in 1905 of the powers of image making. She admired and identified with Queen Victoria, whose assumption of power as a young woman, widowhood, and long reign paralleled her own. The British Queen was famously media savvy, distributing images of herself and her family to the press via painting, photography, and printmaking that fostered perceptions of her as a mother and wife who retained her femininity even in the context of her political power. The Empress Dowager herself had engravings of Queen Victoria and the royal family in her private apartments. One of Cixi's frequent guests was Sarah Pike Conger, wife of the American ambassador to Beijing, shown here to the right of the Empress. It was Mrs. Conger's idea to have a portrait painted of the Empress in order to counter the negative caricatures of her that were published in the foreign press. I thought you'd like that one. As seen, for example, in this cover illustration from the French turn-of-the-century weekly Le Rieur. Note the severed heads in the background and the bloody knife in her left hand. With this intention, Mrs. Conger invited American artist Catherine Carl to paint a portrait that would be shown at the St. Louis Exposition in 1904. Carl, who trained in Paris at the Académie Julian, was in 1904 living with her brother in Shanghai. It must be admitted that the portrait is not very good. Nevertheless, the painting was favorably received at court and sent off to St. Louis. As a manifestation of the Empress, it was shipped there vertically, despite being close to, I believe, 20 feet tall in its frame. Back in Beijing, a little rivalry took place between the foreigners at court. The Dutch legation, feeling slighted that Holland, practically the birthplace of portraiture, had been superseded in this instance by the Americans, advocated for Hubert Vos to come paint the Empress Dowager's portrait. Little did they know that by the time of his arrival in 1905, Vos had in fact become an American citizen. Vos's narrative, told in letters to his families, emphasizes the difficulties of his commission. He had to appear at court at 5 a.m. to meet with the Empress, and had only 4 very brief sessions with her. His studio on the top floor of a Beijing hotel was a sauna in the summer heat. The robes, accessories, and furnishings he had been promised by the eunuchs to use in his studio never materialized, and he had to scrounge his own. And yet, his fascination with the Empress Dowager herself was palpable in his description of her. Erect, with a tremendous willpower, more than I have ever seen in a human being, a brow full of kindness and love for the beautiful, I fell straight in love with her. Vos began with a sketch of the Empress, outlining her features in blocking and shading. His plan was to make a smaller study of her head while she modeled for him, then to create the full-length commission from that study. Following the second session, she asked to see what he had done. Through a translator, she expressed her critique, demanding no shadows, no shadows, no shadows. The Empress Dowager, I argue, had an impact on Vos's portrait of her that none of his other subjects had ever had. Her critique, her bearing, the need to please her, all these factors meant that he adapted his usual practices and conventions to what she would desire. Another anecdote he shared with his family demonstrates the awe he felt in her presence and the pride he felt in her attention. In a pivotal moment after the third session, the Empress approached Vos, taking his pencil in her own hand and making an experimental mark on his sketch. "This is the nearest ever a white man has been to her," he wrote. In the end, he became a complete convert. "I resolved to paint her as if I were a Chinese myself," he stated. To a certain extent, this meant setting aside his own preconceptions about portraiture. Chinese imperial portrait conventions dictated generality over specificity. Facial features were carefully delineated, but by the time of the Qing dynasty, imperial portraiture had become increasingly frontal, symmetrical, and decorative. Renderings of emperors and empresses were increasingly schematic and ritualized. There was almost no palpable body under the symbol-laden robes. As a result, imperial portraiture became less a portrait of an individual and more a symbolic representation of the state. Adding some force to the Empress's demands was the fact that she was an artist herself. Most of her surviving paintings date from after the Boxer Rebellion, when she gave them as gifts to foreign visitors. An example of one of these works is Fungi and Bats of 1898, a delicately painted little still life on a surface of light brown wash. She selected modest subjects, birds, flowers, pines, and calligraphic paintings of single characters. These works were, like Chinese export porcelain, geared toward a non-native audience. She and Vos were similarly entrepreneurial and knew how to please a specific audience. A quick study himself, Vos grasped what the Empress expected of him, despite his own preferences. As he initially noted, "I would have preferred a darker, more mysterious, less symmetrical background." However, he adapted to her wishes, and indeed he remarked about the finished painting, "The whole getup is a symbolical and allegorical composition, more like a monument than a portrait." This influence is apparent in the final full-length portrait. Measuring 92 by 54 inches, the portrait is housed in a frame commissioned by the Empress herself, and thanks to David Fogg for the image on the right. Within the rigidly symmetrical composition, the tiny Empress is ensconced among auspicious paraphernalia. The pyramidal stacks of apples, the peacock fans, the bamboo-painted backdrop, and the banner over her head, which gives her name and title, dominate the composition. Rendered as requested with no shadows, the Empress appears quite youthful, even ageless, and her body seems to disappear within her robes. The peony-decorated fan she holds across her body adds to that effect. Vos reserved his skills in realism for the accoutrement of the throne and surrounding elements, which are rendered in perspective and with shading. The stylistic combination thus incorporates two schemes of visuality, with the result that the painting appears not quite Chinese and not quite Western. The difference in composition, lighting, and formality is especially apparent when we compare this work with Vos's American Society portraits, and even his earlier portraits from China. Compared with the liveliness of many of those works in which the figure seems to breathe before our eyes, his rendering of the Empress is rigid and contained. The Empress's painting was completed in mid-August, and Vos presented it at court. Cix's pleasure was expressed, remarkably enough, in English. very good," she commented. Vos had succeeded. Like many of his society portraits, this painting was intended primarily for an audience of one. During Cix's remaining lifetime, it would not be displayed in an exhibition or hung in a public place for viewing, nor would it eventually function as a traditional ancestor portrait for acts of reverence toward the Empress's spirit. In a way, the very act of having the portrait painted, the Empress's gesture of summoning this artist from across the world to capture her likeness, was the whole point. By inviting Vos, Cixi demonstrated to those at court her newfound openness to Western influence and practices. At the same time, Vos responded to her aesthetic input enough to create what he felt was, in his own words, a semi-Chinese picture. The smaller canvas, completed by Vos upon his return to New York in 1906, is probably based on the original sketch he began at court. Infrared photography of the painting shows how Vos carefully planned the oval composition, and you can see guidelines running all the way around the composition, which is bisected horizontally and vertically, with the lines intersecting just below her chin. He initially sketched in some shading around the eyes, above the lips, and below the chin. Other pencil guidelines can be seen for the fan, showing how deliberately Vos planned the painting. The Empress would almost certainly not have approved of the 3/4 length composition, since cropping the imperial body would have been seen as inauspicious. However, since this painting was planned for exhibition at the 1906 Paris Salon, Vos's composition allowed him to zoom in on the face and figure of the Empress in a way that a full-length painting would not, giving his viewers a more palpable sense of the immediacy of the presence of the Empress. And yet, he largely adhered to the symmetry, frontality, and rigidity of the original portrait, exoticizing his usual, more natural style. Although Vos described this painting as showing the Empress as old as she is, he nevertheless couldn't help deploying the tools of his trade to idealize her. By the age of 70, the Empress's skin was damaged from years of the lead-based makeup she wore, and she had suffered a stroke in 1904. Vos's treatment of her again erased any evidence of this. When we compare this supposedly more realistic version with contemporaneous photographs of the Empress, we can see how Vos narrowed her face, shortened the distance between her nose and upper lip, emphasized her eyelashes, and softened what few shadows there are, giving her skin an airbrushed smoothness, all of this in keeping with Anglo-European conventions of beauty. By closing in on her figure, he could also emphasize the beauty of her accessories. We can see the luster of the pearls in her triple-pierced ears, the sheen of her silk robe, the glow of jade bracelets and rings as they emerge from the darkened background. Finally, the painting was placed in a heavy, dark frame decorated with cloisonné panels. The oval composition laid out by Vos falls perfectly within the corner segments of open carving, with their dragons slithering through clouds. The carving is backed by cloud-patterned, gilded paper, adding to the gaudy richness of the overall effect. Vos had grand hopes for his paintings of the Empress and their impact on his career. He wrote, "The book of a reigning dynasty is a secret closed book and comes only to light when her dynasty ends. Then her life and her reign will be written, and I will figure in it." In terms of his own successful career, he was somewhat correct, as his 1935 New York Times obituary focused on his experiences painting the Empress Dowager. Within the chronicles of Cix's life, Vos's Beijing portrait is merely a footnote. In a certain way, it served her aims, demonstrating her openness to Western culture and modernity to her intimate audience at court. But its existence was for a long time greatly overshadowed by the great political upheavals that took place shortly after her death in 1908, and lost within the cloud of scandals and rumors that obscured the accounting of the Empress's life and reign. For us, however, the two paintings remain as the unusual evidence of the collision between two cultures, two aesthetics, and ultimately two individuals. Thank you.